Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to Exploring the Lord of the Rings. This is session number 316, and tonight we return to Gimli's poem. We're going to continue looking through. We got about 3 stanzas in last time, which is pretty quick work, you have to admit. And yes, we're going to go back and talk about some other things after. This is like the first pass through the poem. Then I want to go back and do some other analysis that I want to show you. So we have a few more sessions on Gimli's poem for sure, but today we're going to complete the our first pass on the poem. Two quick announcements. Like last time, first of all, I've been thinking about this space course that Sarah Brown and James Tauber and I are collaborating on the new collected poetry. And I've decided what I'm going to do. So I'm giving a lecture at our space showcase, which is the weekend after Carolina Moot. So that's the weekend of the 16th. On the 16th of November, I'm going to be giving my first lecture, and I think that's open to everybody. And the poem I'm going to be talking about that day is going to be Tolkien's first ever published poem. The first poem Tolkien ever published. Where did he publish it? He published it in one of his school publications at King Edward's School, and it's a mock epic poem. It's phenomenal. He's imitating a classical poem which celebrates a battle. So he does a parody of this classic poem, but it's instead celebrating their rugby team, the Battle of the Eastern Fields. Exactly, that's the poem we're going to be talking about. No, he wrote it in English. He wrote it in English actually, but at least he does, Nancy, include like a. He pretends that it's a found poem, and then he writes commentary on the side. So anyway, much fun. So I'm looking forward to discussing that a little bit. So that's what that's the poem I'm going to be talking about on the 16th in our space showcase. If you are interested in the fall space showcase, which is going to be a great day with a lot of things going on. The space showcase is the day we do this twice a year, and it's an opportunity to take part in little mini space modules called space capsules. They're like hour-long sessions in which you have you have a real class discussion. Some people will participate, others can just watch, and it gives you a little taste for how our space program works. I definitely encourage folks to look into that. It's free to attend. You just need to register. So go to blackberry.signumuniversity.org, look down in the space section, and you should be able to find links there for the fall space showcase. Anyway, so and I'm going to be talking about the Battle of the Eastern Fields. So, really looking forward to some of Tolkien's early poetry, which is all either extremely serious or extremely not serious, right? That's kind of, Tolkien's youth right there. But yeah. Anyway, so that's what I'm going to talk about there. Now, the other thing I wanted to announce briefly is just to remind you guys that we have one more moot in the fall for the fall moot season, Carolina Moot, which is not this weekend, but next weekend in High Point, North Carolina. We're going to be going down to the southeast there for the first time in several years. We had a couple moots in Carolina years ago, but it's been a while. And so glad to return to North Carolina there. And we're going to be, our theme is learning from speculative fiction. So I think that's going to be pretty cool. So looking forward to discussing a bunch of things, getting to see a bunch of people again there at Carolina Moot in High Point on the 9th of November. That is the week after next. And then, yes, the next one after that, David Michael, as you say, is Osmoot, which is the end of January. Sorry, you're not going to be able to come. That's too bad. It's always sad not to get to see folks in the Southern Hemisphere when I get to go to the Southern Hemisphere for this, but really looking forward to seeing Melbourne and most importantly, getting to connect with all my Osmoot friends again. Aranas, come on now. Seriously. Obviously, you're going to be attending. I don't think that's an open question at all. I think the answer is perfectly obvious, really. So, we'll see. I certainly hope you're able to come. Yeah. But, all right. So let's get back to the poem. All right. So, I'm going to read through the whole poem again. So remember, we're going to start our discussion in stanza 4. What we're looking at right here, we're going through the sense of the poem. We're looking at what the poem is actually conveying, right? We're looking for the shapes and the patterns of how these things are presented. We'll be doing some kind of big picture stuff a little bit later on. But we want to go through and make sure that we are following what the poem emphasizes, right? Of course, poetry is not just sort of free floating, ideas and images. These are, descriptions, trains of thought and sentences and all that sort of thing. So we're gonna follow through that. We got through the first 3 stanzas last time. We're gonna continue that this time. But first, I'll reread the whole thing, then we'll jump back into it. The world was young, the mountains green, no stain yet on the moon was seen. No words were laid on stream or stone when Durin woke and walked alone. He knew nameless hills and dells, he drank from yet untasted wells. He stooped and looked in mirror and saw a crown of stars appear as gems upon a silver thread above the shadow of his head. The world was fair, the mountains tall, in elder days before the fall of mighty... Hang on a second. I got to start that stanza again because I didn't take a big enough breath. The world was fair, the mountains tall, in elder days before the fall of mighty kings in Nargothrond and Gondolin, who now beyond the western seas have passed away. The world was fair in Durin's day. A king he was on carven throne, in many-pillared halls of stone, with golden roof and silver floor, and runes of power upon the door. The light of sun and star and moon, in shining lamps of crystal hewn, undimmed by cloud or shade of night, there shone forever, fair and bright. Remember what we were noticing about the enjambment and the sentence structure. We so much enjambment there in stanza 2, right? Of which was all one sentence. We had 6 lines, one single sentence, right? In the 3rd stanza, we had 8 lines, and it was divided into 2 sentences, each of which was exactly 4 lines, right? Okay. Keep going. Their hammer on the anvil smote, their chisel clove and graver wrote, their forged was blade and bound was hilt, the delver mined, the mason built, their barrel pearl and opal pale, and metal wrought like fish's mail, buckler and corselet, axe and sword, and shining spears were laid in hoard. Unwearied then were Durin's folk, beneath the mountains music woke, the harpers harped, the minstrels sang, and at the gates the trumpets rang. The world is grey, the mountains old, the forge's fire is ashen cold. No harp is rung, no hammer falls, the darkness dwells in Durin's halls. The shadow lies upon his tomb in Moria, in Khazad-dûm. But still the sunken stars appear in dark and windless mirror. There lies his crown in water deep, till Durin wakes again from sleep. All right. So, what'd you notice? What'd you notice as we got into stanza 3 here? Cool. Bjorning asks, is it always enjambment when there's no punctuation after a line? No, not necessarily. Often, I mean, there's a high correlation, let's say that, but certainly it's when. So look at that second stanza, which I said is the most heavily enjambed. The world was fair, the mountains tall in elder days, before the fall of mighty kings in Nargothrond and Gondolin, who now beyond the western seas. So enjambment is basically happening when it does not make any sense at all to pause at the end of the line, where like you are conscious, you basically can't pause at the end of the line without screwing it up, essentially. I mean, you could, if you wanted to, you could force a pause there, but if you do, you completely lose the sense of the lines, right? In elder days, before the fall, what fall? Of mighty kings in Nargothrond. Okay. And Gondolin, who now beyond. Like, and Gondolin, who now beyond, is a line that makes no sense on either end, right? I mean, you've got a phrase, Nargothrond and Gondolin, which is split by the end of a line. You've got after who now beyond the western seas, right? So you're separating a preposition from the object of the preposition, beyond the western seas, right? Those kinds of things make it really clear that this is enjambed. Like, you can't just separate the preposition from the object of the preposition in a prepositional phrase, right? Like, you can't be like, I looked out the window, right? You know, without enjamming it, right? Like, that doesn't work at all. Now, but if you look, Bjorning, at the third stanza, the second one on the page. A king he was on carven throne, in many pillared halls of stone, with golden roof and silver floor, and runes of power upon the door. Now, there's no punctuation at the end of the first two lines there. And you could say it's enjambed, but you'll notice that there's much less urgency in that enjambment, right? Before the fall of mighty kings in Nargothrond and Gondolin, who now beyond the western seas have passed away, right? I mean, that's just one flowing phrase. Like, again, the line breaks are almost inserted, like, in places where you're compelled to continue going, right? In those first two lines, or we'll call it the first three lines of the next stanza, it's not that same way, right? Can you hear that? A king he was on carven throne, in many pillared halls of stone, with golden roof and silver floor. So the second line is a prepositional phrase all by itself. In many pillared halls of stone, right? Well, it's, of stone is another preposition phrase that modifies halls, right? But anyway, you got one set of phrases there, right? Then with golden roof and silver floor, another prepositional phrase. Now, they're all modifying what came before, right? The throne, where's the throne? In many pillared halls of stones. What are the halls of stone like? Well, they've got a golden roof and a silver floor, right? But at the same time, each line contains a separate idea. In many pillared halls of stone. Okay, we're talking about, and that's this line, you're imagining the halls. In the next line, you're imagining the roof and the floor, right? It's connected, but it's not, it is not enjambed in the same kind of way that we saw in the second. Do you see what I mean? Yeah, Bjorning, that's exactly right. If that works for you, I'm glad. I love diagramming sentences myself. Bjorning says if you were diagramming this sentence, in stanza 3, each line would have its own diagrammatic branch. Yes, exactly. So if that helps you, awesome. The number of people who still diagram sentences in this cold, hard digital world are too few, in my opinion. I love diagramming sentences, but yeah. Anyway, I think this certainly is a good way. It's a good way to think about it. Again, look at the second quatrain, the last four lines in that third stanza. Same kind of thing, right? The light of sun and star and moon in shining lamps of crystal hewn, undimmed by cloud or shade of night, there shone forever fair and bright. Now you could say that there's a little bit more of like enjambment momentum between the seventh and eighth line of that stanza. Undimmed by cloud or shade of night, there shone forever fair and bright, right? But once again, in each line is kind of its own thing, right? First, let's describe the light of sun and star and moon. Like, let's announce that light, right? Now, where is it? Oh, it's in shining lamps of crystal hewn. What are they like? Well, they're undimmed by cloud or shade of night, in point of fact, right? And what were they doing to it? Does this sentence have a verb? Oh, yes, it does. They're shown forever, fair and bright, right? Again, not the same kind of enjambment thing that's going on in the first stanza. So that by itself is kind of interesting. That is the difference in pacing between these. And I will say stanza 3 is going to be far more typical of this poem than stanza 2 in that way. The remarkable momentum, the enjambment there in stanza 2 is much more unusual in this poem. And notice also another thing. This is one of the things this is one of the things I don't understand about this poem. So this poem is in stanzas. I said that everything about the structure of this poem was like totally regular and totally normal. That's almost true. The one that is the meter is extraordinarily, almost metronomically regular. The rhyme scheme is really simple and also almost completely unvarying. But Bob, that's exactly right. The stanza length is different. And I think here we can see an example of how it's not just the stanza length that's different. It's the stanza, how should we say, flavor, right? The entire feeling of the stanzas. Stanzaic poetry, there are two sort of popular modes for dividing poetry up into stanzas. One is when you use a stanza structure as a way to impose like another kind of, so you've got the line structure and then you've got a rhyme scheme, and then you fit it into a stanza, and like also all the stanzas are the same, right? Maybe they vary a little bit, but mostly not. Usually, I mean, normally that would be uncommon, right? So you do, and you know, there are many poets that Tolkien loved who wrote stanzaic poetry. For instance, very notably, Pearl, one of Tolkien's favorite poems, which he translated from Middle English, is a stanzaic poem with actually a rather intense stanzaic structure. Pearl is a remarkable poem, really quite a phenomenal piece of artistry, poetic artistry, and Tolkien admired it very much. The other way to do stanzas, if you're not doing like a particular stanza shape, and the shape of it is normally made by number of lines and often rhyme scheme, but the most famous, I think, example, this would not have been Tolkien's favorite example, but the most famous example, I think, is Edmund Spenser's Faerie Queene, where he has established a stanza structure and runs with it for 1,000 pages. I did my undergraduate thesis on the Faerie Queene. I love the Faerie Queene. One of my favorites. Edmund Spenser, could write a line. Oh man, his sense of rhythm is so gorgeous. The Fairy Queen aloud is just music. We should read Tolkien's translation of Gawain, Perro, and Sir Orfeo in the Academy. We totally should. I agree, Bricktails. Okay, anyway, but I'm getting distracted. As I say, that's one form of poetic stanzas. The other form is like if you have like a more longer flowing poetic narrative, and you use stanza breaks as something akin to paragraph breaks, essentially, in in prose. That is a kind of thing that happens sometimes, just to prevent, even just kind of visually on the page, the thing from being this like continuous unbroken thing. Sometimes poets will do that. Tolkien does that in some of his longer poems. Anyway, yeah, Ambrosius, we could totally do the Fairy Queen in the Mythgard Academy, but man, you thought the Mallory class took a long time. We'd have to do it in chunks because it's the longest poem in the English language, for crying out loud. It's really long, really. It's literally 1,000 pages long, 1,000 pages of narrative poetry. It is. Hey, look, I love the Fairy Queen. Love the Fairy Queen. But yeah. Anyway, okay, getting distracted. Point is, Gimli's poem does neither one of these things, right? And that's already interesting. So look at what we've seen already. This opening stanza is sometimes one and sometimes two stanzas. But anyway, so we've got this structure. This is a 10-line structure. And notice how it's split. The first 4 lines are clearly a unit, and then the last 6 lines are a unit. So this is 10 lines, but it's split up 4 and 6. And you can hear it. You can hear the split. The world was young, the mountains green, no stain yet on the moon was seen, no words were laid on stream or stone, when Durin woke and walked alone. He named the nameless hills and dells, he drank from yet untasted wells, he stooped and looked in mirror, and saw a crown of stars appear, as gems upon a silver thread, above the shadow of his head. In fact, you can notice that the thing that defines the flow of these paragraphs is Tolkien's syntax. It's the sentences, right? The first 4 lines are one sentence. The last 6 lines are a second sentence. Stanza 2 lines, and it's one sentence and one continuous sentence, right? This fully enjammed thing. And then we have 8 lines with 2 even 4-line sentences, right? Let's see what happens as we go on. The point, of course, that I'm building to is there's no obvious pattern within this poem. Pattern of stanzas. They vary. So I want to get a better feel for how that happens. But kind of put that in the back of our minds for now, and let's focus on, we'll come back to it, but let's focus first on the content, right? The actual words here. Their hammer on the anvil smote, their chisel clove and graver wrote, there forged was blade and bound was hilt, the delver mined, the mason built. Their beryl, pearl, and opal pale, and metal wrought like fish's mail, buckler and corslet, axe and sword, and shining spears were laid in hoard. Okay. So, of course, since we're paying attention to that, it will inescapably strike your notice that this is an 8-line stanza with, again, 2 sentences, each 4 lines, just like stanza 3, right? But notice the effect that he does here, right? Yes, Bob, there's the one line that breaks the rhythm. Buckler and corslet, axe and sword is the only... Buckler is the only word in the entire poem which is not iambic. because it has a stress on the first syllable. Buckler and corslet, axe and corslet, axe and sword. The rest of it's fine. It's buckler. Buckler's backwards. Yeah. Okay, so yes, Gildaloin, the theirs, right? Their hammer on the anvil smote, their chisel clove and graver wrote, their forged was blade and bound was hilt, the delver mined, the mason built. Yes, lots of passive construction, right? What's missing in those first 3 lines? People, right? Dwarves, actually. The hammer is smiting on the anvil as if all by itself. The chisel is cleaving things. Again, independently, apparently. And by the way, this is a kind of use. Well, no, this is not even the passive voice, because it's not grammatically passive. What makes it feel like the passive voice is that the doer of the action is concealed, right? Normally you would say, like the smith swung the hammer, right? Like the hammer would be the object of the action being performed, or at least perhaps, of course, the instrument. It would be the dwarf, it'd be the smith who would be performing the action, right? And when you take a phrase like that and you remove the doer of the action and make them invisible, that's often one of the things that the passive voice does, right? Like that's the disrespectful use, like not disrespectful, like the disreputable, that's what I mean. The disreputable use of the passive voice, right? When people say things like mistakes were made, right? They're hiding the subject of the verb on purpose, right? Because they're wanting to distract attention away from the doer, that they were the ones who made the mistakes. As I say, that's like the more disreputable use of the passive voice. But notice that again, that's not what happens here. In the first 2 lines, at least, right? Instead, the action is invested in the tools themselves. Their hammer on the anvil smote, their chisel clove and graver wrote, their forged was blade and bound was hilt. There we are, exactly as you say, Johnny, shifting to actual passive voice, right? The blade was forged, the hilt was bound. And in all 3 lines, the doers, the dwarves, the doers of the actions, the dwarves themselves, the smiths, are invisible. And then we get them in line 4, the delver mined, the mason built. Why do you think? What is the effect, do you think, of I keep losing track of the game in the background when I'm talking about poetry. Why do you think they do this? I certainly don't think it's because they're trying to, it's not like they're trying to hide the fact that it was the dwarves doing this or something like that. Bjorning, that sounds a little bit more like it. The crafts are more significant than the craftsmen, something like that. Yeah. Notice the other thing that is in those first 3 lines. Notice the other thing that's emphasized. What is our attention drawn to? Not just the actions, which are being performed as if on their own, right? We have not even just the products, right? The 3rd line gives us the products, the blade and the hilt, the product of the craftsmanship. The first 2, Eric, yes, exactly, focus on the instruments, right? But notice the repeated word. There, there, there. Exactly, Miss Ray. Yes. And it's interesting because that word is an unstressed word in the line. Again, they're all three perfectly iambic lines. We haven't gotten to bucklers yet, right? They're three perfectly iambic lines. They're hammer on, they're chisel, they're forged, right? Hammer, chisel, forged. That's where the stress of the word, that's where the stress of the beat falls, right? So there's an offbeat word, and yet we get it every single time. And notice how it's easy just to kind of skim over it the first time. Their hammer on the anvil smote, right? If you just have that line, it's like, what's that about? That line is about the hammer, right? The focus is on the hammer in that line. Their chisel clove and graver wrote, okay, right? Their forged was blade and bound was hilt. But when you read them all together, you get that repeated word at the beginning of the sentence, which you begin to hear more and more as it gets repeated 3 times in a row. Their hammer on the anvil smote, their chisel clove and graver wrote, their forged was blade and bound was hilt, the delver mined, the mason built, their beryl, pearl, and opal pale. We get it again there, of course, in line 5, right? We start the next sentence with there as well. Remember what this poem is about, right? The first stanza gives us Durin waking, naming things, stooping and looking in mirror and seeing the crown of stars appear. All the dwarves know what this is. This is the origin story of Khazad-dûm. How did Durin discover Khazad-dûm and named it? Then we get some external context. The world was fair in Durin's day. You know, back when the elves were doing things like building kingdoms and then having them collapse and whatever. Yeah, that's the day we're talking about. He, Durin, was a king on carven throne. And then we get the description. Now we're getting Khazad-dûm itself, right? Having discovered Khazad-dûm, having implicitly given the name to Khazad-dûm. He's been naming things in stanza 1, Durin was. Though he did not name, in the poem has not named the place yet, right? Notice how the third stanza ends. The light of sun and star and moon in shining lamps of crystal hewn, undimmed by cloud or shade of night, there shone forever, fair and bright, their hammer on. Little springboard into the theirs at the end of that line, right? Last line of stanza 3 and starting with there. There shone forever, fair and bright. Speaking of there, what else was happening there? We get all this stuff, right? And I agree with Rowan that it's almost as if the place had the greatest agency in the great works that were created there. Yes. The dwarves are not what is being emphasized. I do agree. Some of you were talking about this. I do agree that this seems to be a humility thing, right? It's not about the dwarves. It's not about their own personal glory, right? What matters is the work that was done, and all of this work was done there, right? That is the story of this place. What is Khazad-dûm? What was Khazad-dûm about? It was about the hammers that were smitten on anvils there, the chisels that clove there, the blades and hilts that were forged and bound, the gravers who wrote, the delvers who mined, the masons built. All of these things happened there. And then notice where he goes with there in the second half of the stanza. Their beryl, pearl, and opal pale, and metal wrought like fish's mail, buckler and corslet, axe and sword, and shining spears were laid in hoard. What else is there? We've got the first half talks about work, craftsmanship, smith work, carving work, graving, forging, binding, delving, building, all these things, right? And also there was treasure. Notice that the word there has introduced verbs, right? Ever since we were oriented to that at the end of stanza 3, they're shown. Remember the second sentence there in stanza 3? You know, we had the light of sun and star and moon. So light was the subject of that verb, and we didn't get to the verb, right? We got the subject, the light, and we didn't get to the verb until they're shown. Forever, fair and bright, finally, in the last line. So there, introduced the verb. There shown. Their hammer on the anvil smote. Their chisel clove, and graver wrote. Their forged was blade, and bound was hilt. The delver mind, the mason built. There has given us the verbs, right? This is what happened there. These are the things that happened there. But notice now we get another transition out of it. We get there again, right? But it doesn't introduce a verb. It introduces nouns. There beryl, pearl, and opal pale, and metal wrought like fish's mail, buckler and corslet, axe and sword, and shining spears were laid in hoard. That's the verb. They were laid, which is a passive, of course, but it's also it is not only not an action verb in the grammatical sense, it's not an active verb in the meaning sense either, right? It's about putting things down. It's about storing things away. It's not about doing anything, right? And look at all those nouns, for crying out loud, right? We got these long list. Treasure first, armor, metal wrought like fish's mail, more arms and weapons, buckler and corslet, axe and sword, and shining spears were laid in hoard. Yeah. Yes, that is interesting, isn't it? Eric says even the list of nouns is natural stones first, then product of work. Yeah. Beryl, pearl, and opal. Those aren't even... Well, maybe the beryl would be a cut stone, wouldn't it? Right, and then we get metal. And shining spears were laid in hoard. The great wealth of Khazad-dûm. Yes, pearls aren't mined. Yes, the pearl is out of place. Cherished. It's in the hoard. Well, now, keep in mind, it doesn't say they got all those stones from the mountain, right? It's describing what's in the hoard. Presumably, beryls, pearls, and opals were three of the things that they valued most. Yeah, remember there's a line in the Silmarillion about how much the dwarves value pearls. It was like one of the main things. Círdan came through again, as he so often does. Where would Thingol be without Círdan, right? He wouldn't have gotten far without him. But Círdan, of course, supplies them with pearls. Yeah, so the dwarves import the pearls. Absolutely. Absolutely. No, there are no clams in the deep, Rowan. No. Yeah. Right, exactly. It doesn't say anything about any of them being mined, just that they're all laid in hoard. That's exactly right, Bjorning. That's exactly right. Yes. The point of the stanza, then, the first 4 lines, so we've got another 8-line stanza, just like the last one. The first 4 lines is all about the verbs. The second 4 lines are all about the nouns. None of them are directly about the dwarfs. Exactly, right? We do get some, in a sense, some dwarves. We get gravers, delvers, and masons, right? But even there, we're getting them by, by title, by role, rather than by, personage or anything. It's not remembering famous dwarves. It's not even emphasizing the dwarves. It's just emphasizing what they did. So the first 4 lines, what happened there? All the craftsmanship of the many different kinds that happened there. And then the second 4 lines, what stuff was there? What stuff was laid in hoard there? Precious stones, armor, weapons, all of them beautiful, wrought like fish's mail, shining spears, not just spears, but shining spears, right? Were laid in hoard. Now, that reminds me of the last stanza. So this is the second stanza in a row that we've now had this 8-line structure. 8-line structure in 2 separate quatrains with the 2 sentences, right, in the stanza. Sorry, I just noticed something funny. The second line in each quatrain is an in phrase. In many pillared halls of stone, in shining lamps of crystal hewn. And of course, the second line of the second stanza, in elder days before the fall. Yeah, Bob, you're just noticing that too. Yeah. That's interesting. That's just about a pattern now, isn't it? A king he was on carven throne in many pillared halls of stone. The light of sun and star and moon in shining lamps of crystal hewn. You get the king in the first quatrain, the light in the second quatrain, and then you situate them in place, right? In many pillared halls of stone, it's where the throne is. In shining lamps, that's where the light is. Yeah. The rest of them, they're not exactly fully. The lines 3 and 4 of the quatrains are less carefully paralleled with each other. Oh, hang on. Don't, Johnny, you're jumping way ahead. Don't ignore it. There are no future stanzas, just the ones we're talking about, right? We'll get there. Okay. Sorry, what I was looking at was, before I got distracted by the in phrases there. No, there isn't. The parallelism I was just looking at there emphasizes more than anything else that the structure of the 2 quatrains are very similar to each other in stanza 3, right? Stanza 4, we get something different. The relationship between the 2 is different. Again, we got the verb thing and the noun thing going on there. And there's a departure. All of the short clipped clauses in the first half. Their hammer on the anvil smote, their chisel clove and graver wrote, their forged was blade and bound was hilt, the delver mined, the mason built. Right? Those are all short things. And then the hoard is one big thing, right? One long list. It's not exactly enjammed, not in the same way that stanza 2 is enjammed, but it all flows together. This is all one big idea, right? One subject, one verb. Well, okay, I say one subject, one very compound subject, right? Because all of the entire list are, in fact, the subject of the verbs were laid in hoard, right? Okay, all right. Then we get a 4-line stanza. Unwearied then were Durin's folk. Hey, there are dwarves who live there, right? We get a stanza about the dwarves. Unwearied then were Durin's folk, beneath the mountains music woke. The harpers harped, the minstrels sang, and at the gates the trumpets rang. Yeah, Drustnik says the people are secondary to the accomplishment. Yeah. Little Room Johnny, great question. Does hoard necessarily have a negative connotation? I wouldn't think so. I'm thinking back to Thorin and company, right? I don't. They object to the hoard being Smaug's hoard, right? But no, I don't think. I think to lay those things in hoard is a good thing. I don't think it's negative. There's a negative connotation to the word hoard among people who don't have as much stuff, right? If you have a lot of stuff, hoarding it, you would probably have positive connotations with the verb hoard in that sentence, right? If you are saying that your neighbor is hoarding all this stuff that you wish you had, there's probably a negative connotation to it, right? Yeah. So, no, but in general, I mean, I say this because, of course, there is that kind of sense that dynamic is clearly present in The Hobbit, right? With the, people of Lake Town and that sort of thing, Thorin being told to, eat his gold, if you will, right? So that element of scarcity and selfishness and a lack of generosity, but remember also the dwarves' song, when they redo the Over the Misty, Far Over the Misty Mountains Cold song. Remember the end of it. Here at the gates, your king awaits. His hands are rich with gems and gold. He's ready to distribute gems and gold to his people, right? To his faithful supporters and liege people. So yeah, no, I don't think, I do not believe there is a glimmer of criticism implied in that 4th stanza there. Yeah, I think that's true. They were hoarding all these things, and they meant nothing but good. That is, by their description of it. And I hear that, like I said, that Little Room Johnny and was saying it seems to carry the weight of greed, and Kurtzman says hoarding seems to have an inherent selfishness. Yeah, I hear that. And again, that's not a strange association to make. There are elements of it at times in the text, in The Hobbit most clearly, right? It's very clear there are proper ways to handle hoards, right? But again, that doesn't make the hoard wrong or evil in its sense, right? Yeah. But is there implied criticism here? No. No, this stanza is a stanza of praise. I think that's very clear. But let's get back to the people, the folk. Unwearied then were Durin's folk, beneath the mountains music woke. The harpers harped, the minstrels sang, and at the gates the trumpets rang. Okay, what do you notice here? So first of all, we get another stanza, we get another quatrain rather, which that's normal. 4-line sentences have been all the rage for the last 5 sentences, right? Stanzas 3, 4, and 5 are all consist of these quatrains. The only thing that's odd is that it doesn't. Oh, I think I see. Hang on. I think I see. Let's focus on this quatrain first. Unwearied then were Durin's folk. Beneath the mountains music woke. So, folk, that's the subject of the sentence, right? And the rest of... So these 4 lines, reflecting back on our verb quatrain and our noun quatrain in the previous stanza, right? This is another verb thing. What are they doing? They're waking music beneath the mountains. There's harping. There's singing. The harpers harped, the minstrels sang, should remind us of the delver mind the mason built, right? Directly parallel to that. And at the gates the trumpets rang. Isn't it interesting that when we get actual dwarves referred to, like actual dwarves, as dwarves, Durin's folk, right? We're invited to actually imagine dwarves doing stuff. And what are we told? What are we invited to imagine them doing? When they come in, we just get music. We got all of this craftsmanship happening, but that's not what's connected with Durin's folk. Yes, Rowan, I think you're exactly right. So that's really interesting. Okay. This sentence is complicated. Syntactically. Unwearied then were Durin's folk. So the thing we're told about them first is that they were unwearied. It's that adjective, right? Well, like past participle, but still, that adjective. They were unwearied then. When? You know, Durin's day. That's when. Unwearied then were Durin's folk. Notice the small hint. It's not exactly a downer, but it implies that dwarves today are maybe a little bit more wearied than they were back then. Back then, Durin's folk were unwearied. And then, unwearied then were Durin's folk. So, by the way, I keep emphasizing the sort of the lack of dwarves in stanza 4, right? I am not at all attempting to distance the dwarves from any of those activities, right? The point is just that the poem emphasizes the verbs and even the tools. And there, right? And the place. The first line of the fifth stanza there, unwearied then were Durin's folk, makes it perfectly clear that Durin's folk have been doing all those things, right? It's Durin's folks that have been smiting the anvil with a hammer, cleaving with chisels, writing as gravers, forging blades, binding hilts, laying bunches of things in hoard, right? They've been doing all this stuff. And they were then unwearied. And I think then has two senses. One sense is back then as opposed to nowadays, right? But the second meaning, I think, is unwearied then, like after they'd done all that stuff. Having done all those things described in stanza 4, having done all that stuff, they were still unwearied. Semicolon. Beneath the mountains, music woke. Now, this is here's what I love about that second line. What I love about that second line is it's ambivalent. What I mean is, it could be taken in more than one sense. Both work, I think. That is, unwearied then were Durin's folk. Beneath the mountains, music woke. That is, did Durin's folk wake the music beneath the mountains? Like, what's the subject and what's the verb? What's the object here, right? Woke could be by parallelism, basically. Unwearied then were Durin's folk. Beneath the mountains, parentheses, they, music woke. The music would then be the direct object. And the dwarves, Durin's folk, are the implied subject there. Or the music could be the subject. Music woke beneath the mountains. Like, music just woke up, right? Beneath the mountains. And that proposition, music was awakened beneath the mountains. Music woke up beneath the mountains, is just kind of paired with unwearied then were Durin's folk. Kurtzimus, that's precisely what I was thinking. Music had fled there from the ruins of Thangarodrim. No, music had fled there from somewhere else. See, this is not talking about the Balrog. Does this sentence sound like it's talking about the Balrog? No, I think there's deliberate irony there, right? No, I think it is connected with the Balrog. I do. But it's not actually about the Balrog. This is what woke up. When the Balrog wakes up, the Balrog is the hideous, twisted version, right? Someday, destruction is going to awake. Someday, doom is going to awake beneath the mountain, right? Something is going to awake beneath the mountains that is going to lay Khazad-dûm in ruin. But first, before that happens, and for a long time before that happens, something else woke up beneath the mountains after Durin saw the crown of stars appear above the shadow of his head. There's a long stretch of time between Durin looking in the mirror and the Balrog awakening. And during that time, something else beneath the mountains, and that was music. The more I think about it this way, the more I like this sense of things. It is as if, and we're not supposed to forget about that last stanza. Unwearied then were Durin's folk. After, doing all that stuff, And the unwearied dwarves, they're doing all those things, doing all this craftsmanship, bringing together all of this treasure, all of this wonderful stuff. That's music. That's like, I think, that's like the music. The Balrog is in a sense a sort of a reverse paradigm for this, right? Beneath the mountains, there is something dark, but also kind of, and if you understand, I'm using this word with a small d, divine, right? That is, there is something from the music, something from the discord, Melkor's discord, lying beneath the mountains. But that discord, there was also the music for which the Balrog was itself the discord, right? When the dwarves were there doing what they did, when Durin's folk, unwearied, were doing all of these acts of craftsmanship, when all this craftsmanship was just happening, right? With the unwearied folk there, beneath the mountains, music woke up beneath the mountains, like an echo of Aule's own music. A reprise of part of the great music itself. And yeah, Melkor's discord is going to wake up eventually, but it's not there yet. And this is first and foremost about that time. But then notice where it goes. Colon. The music woke. Colon. So the colon indicates what comes next is, a semicolon indicates a significant break between the first and the second. So I do think it's not just I had always read it as if the folk were waking up music, which is fun and also is kind of true. Again, it's ambivalent. It can work in either way, especially when you're just listening to it. It works in either way. But I think the semicolon suggests that the music is the subject of the verb, not the object of the verb. But then you get the colon. And a colon introduces like a further like list or explanation, like, you know, tell us more about this music that woke up beneath the mountains. What did that music consist of? Well, he'll tell us. The harpers harped, the minstrels sang, and at the gates the trumpets rang. That's what. Notice, so I saw some of you talking about trumpets ringing, which seemed strange to you. Ring would be a strange word to use of somebody doing something to a trumpet. Like nobody would say, hey, could you go ring that trumpet, please? But you absolutely would use it the other way around. That is, it's not a verb that's used. That verb is kind of the giveaway here in this line of how we're supposed to read it, right? Because it's not about the person. Ring isn't something that a person does to a trumpet. Ring is something that the sound of a trumpet does, right? Especially in or even near a cave, Gildalwyn. Yes, yes. The trumpets ring. The trumpets, that is not an object, right? Durin's folk are not ringing trumpets. At the gates, the trumpets, subject, rang, verb. The trumpets are ringing at the gates. In other words, notice this, the third and fourth line are a return to our verb lines. In the first quatrain of stanza 4 there. Just like the hammer was smiting on its own, the chisel was cleaving on its own, so the trumpets are ringing as if on their own, right? And of course, the harpers harped, the minstrel sang, just like the delver mined, the mason built, right? Notice the difference there? Harpers and minstrels is plural, delver and mason is singular. Do you see the effect of that? The first time, graver, delver, mason. Again, we're not invited to imagine the delvers mining, because that's in imagining people, right? To say the delver mined, there were lots of delvers, right? But it's abstract, right? The mason built. Again, it's not about the person, it's about like the job, the role, R-O-L-E, that they have, right? No, I don't think it's about them being into like working alone and making music together. No. Again, there's no dwarves in that fourth stanza at all, right? We even graver, delver, mason, where you can argue, yeah, there are dwarves there, right? Well, no. There's like the abstract concept of one who graves, one who delves, one who, I almost said maces, right? Yeah, it's an abstraction for all of the dwarves who ever did that, right? It's not talking about the actions of a dwarf. It's talking about a piece of craftsmanship that happens. The delver mined, the mason built. But when you pluralize it, the harpers harped. Now we are imagining a bunch of harpers. Now we're imagining people. A bunch of harpers harping. A bunch of minstrels singing. Do you see what I mean? Right? Minstrels, minsting. Yeah. Yes. Now, the pluralization, we're imagining people. Why? Because we started this stanza with Durin's folk, right? We're bringing in Durin's folk. This whole last stanza is inviting us, announces that it's about Durin's folk, collectively, the group of people, right? And so we get harpers, plural harping, and minstrels, plural singing. Which is the music that woke beneath the mountains? And at the gates the trumpets rang. But again, remember the parallel. The harpers harped, the minstrel sang, and at the gates the trumpets rang is just like their hammer on the anvil smote, their chisel clove and graver wrote. The trumpets are ringing just like the trumpets rang just like the chisel clove, right? Notice, by the way, hammer, anvil, chisel, blade, hilt are all singular also, because again, abstraction in that same way, right? Presumably there was more than one hammer in Khazad-dûm, right? Gonna go out on a limb and guess that, right? But again, singular abstraction. Why do the trumpets have to be at the gates? Aspen asked, which is a great question. Why? Where did we get the gates before? What is the poem? Remember, think internally to the poem now. Don't associate with anything else. Time out. Let me explain that. Whenever you're looking at a poem like this, it's not wrong to make connections to other things, but you've got to maintain a kind of hierarchy, right? The first point of emphasis has to be internal to the poem, because this poem is its own artifact. It's a free-floating artifact, which Gimli happens to be quoting for us, right? So the first priority is to see the connections being made within the poem itself. But the second layer of hierarchy, like, it's okay that you can also then connect it to the rest of the Lord of the Rings itself. Like and I would include the Hobbit here as the way that the Hobbit's been invoked and kind of incorporated into the larger story officially, right? In the Fellowship of the Ring. So we can include that too. We can't include the Silmarillion because we don't know what to include. It hadn't been published yet. His idea, it's like, yeah, he's alluding to stuff, but it's hard, right? I mean, again, we can, and we were thinking about the music and such. It's out there, but that's a third hierarchy, right? And then only the fourth layer of things would be to make associations to things outside of Tolkien's work entirely. What I mean by hierarchy is when you're trying to explain something, when you're like, what is this line referring to? You've got to go through that hierarchy. First, is it referring to something in the poem? Can that be explained from within the poem? If so, do it. If so, do that first and lay your primary emphasis there. If not possible, then you go down your priority list, right? If you can't explain a line by something, a connection within the poem, then go outward to the rest of the Lord of the Rings. But stop there, right? Can it be explained from within the Lord of the Rings? Especially the stuff that came earlier in the story. And then, third priority, outside, like the Silmarillion and other ideas that we know that Tolkien had, other stories that we know were in his mind, and that he had written and thought about, like things like the Ainulindalë, right? Even though they hadn't been published yet. And then fourth, things outside. Right, things like Norse mythology or other books that he might have read. I would then introduce a fifth level of the hierarchy, like to things that Tolkien had never even read. Right, those you can make associations like that. You can make comparisons like that. But again, if you're trying to explain the line, that's like way down the list. Anyway, does that make sense? This is a really, once you think about it, it's a really simple kind of intuitive thing, but it's really easy to lose your head. Once you start playing the like free association game, right? Like this line makes me think of that other thing, and like something will pop into your head and it might be like relevant and it might not be. But always prioritize first the poem itself, right? Anyway, so yeah, the free association game is a lot of fun, Jackie. It is, and my goodness, like in my history as an English professor, I have read a lot of free association analysis from students, yeah, sometimes it's a lot of fun, sometimes less so. Anyway, so where does, oh yes, at the gates the trumpets rang. That's where I was coming from. First, within the poem, what do we think about when we're thinking about when we're trying to answer the question, why are the trumpets ringing at the gates? It's a great question. Why at the gates in particular are the trumpets ringing? Well, first, within the poem. What do we got within the poem? See, don't even be thinking about speak, friend, and enter. That's second level of the hierarchy. Inside the poem first. There you go, Eric. And runes of power upon the door. That's the one. The gates themselves are not mentioned, but the door is mentioned. Yep, runes of power upon the door. That's the line we should be remembering. And of course, that recollection, when we go back and notice it, should be underlined by the fact that, notice they're both the fourth lines of a quatrain. We ended the first quatrain of stanza 3 with "and runes of power upon the door." And now we're ending the quatrain in stanza 5 with, and at the gates the trumpets rang. Right? Okay. So what do we do there? How does that connection help us? Well, remember we were asking about the runes of power. Like, we're asking a very similar question there. Why are there runes of power on the door? Why are there runes of power upon the door? And not just upon the back door, the one that they came in, upon the front door, presumably. Because it's cool, yes. Because it's strong. The first time, both, I would argue. So the thing to do is just kind of compare and contrast. Not only just compare and contrast the things like runes of power with trumpets, but looking at the effect that it has, like in its context. Both, and this is connected with both being in the fourth line. So again, what does that mean? What does that do? Well, look how the runes of power work. A king he was on carven throne. The context. This is identification of Durin with his throne in many pillared halls of stone. Remember we talked about the halls of stone being carved out of the mountain? With golden roof and silver floor and runes of power upon the door. We've got the majesty of the place. We've got the splendor of the place, golden roof and silver floor. And then the strength of it. And runes of power upon the door. One of the only references to... Is it magic? Yeah, Eric exactly is having the same hesitation you just were. It could just be words or names. I mean, runes you use to spell things, right? Eric, I do think that it's designed to suggest... there's probably at least one thing that the word that the runes spelled on the door, right? If we had to make a guess at one word that probably appeared in runes on the door of Khazad-dûm, I'm gonna go with not exit. No, I'm gonna go with Durin. And I have to admit I'm going with that because that's what was there in runes yeah, that's what was there. That was what was written on the back door too, right? I think, yeah. I think that his name itself, runes spelling out his name, would be runes of power in a different sense. And remember, just again, notice how the rest of the stanza into which this is the conclusion, right? The grandeur, the magnitude, the majesty, the splendor of his throne in halls and runes of power upon the door. I think it very likely they were magical runes as well. Runes of power. Runes of power like that would keep the doors shut, that would make them inviolable by anyone. But of course, in a sense, Durin's name would do that too. And then we get, at the gates, the trumpets rang. And trumpets are, as a couple of you were just saying, also majesty, also power. Except, and actually, if the runes of power on the door are, at least in part, referring to what was blazoned on the door, both trumpets and signage make announcements to the outside world. That's why trumpets are associated with kings, right? Excuse me, everybody. King coming through is what trumpets meant in some contexts. But here in this context, the runes of power were about that strength, majesty, splendor, power. Here, it's the music. Yes, Durin's power was great. Yes, Durin's majesty was spectacular. But there is, I agree, Eric, joy in the music as well. In the ringing of trumpets at the gates. Have you ever heard a harp accompanied by a trumpet? Probably not, because that would lead to a disgruntled harper in my experience as a former trumpet player. That is to say, harpers harping and trumpets ringing are really at the opposite ends of the musical spectrum, in a sense, right? We start with very gentle music of harpers harping, and then we get the ringing of trumpets at the gates. Opposite extremes. And in the middle, minstrel singing. Yes, exactly. That's the transition. Harpers, minstrels, trumpets. Right. Yes. But the music that woke beneath the mountains, remember that colon? Beneath the mountains, music woke, colon. And this is all of this. This is the music that woke beneath the mountains. It's the music of dwarves, plural harpers, plural minstrels, like we're imagining actual harpers and minstrels here. Actual trumpets ringing at the gates. But of course, remember the ambivalence of that music line. All of this stuff, all of their work, all of their craftsmanship, all of these beautiful things laid in hoard is also the music that was wakened beneath the mountains by the dwarves. Yes, it's all music. It's all music. Yes. Now, my final question. So why is this stanza only one quatrain? Why don't we get a second quatrain here? We've established that pattern now. So we're a little uneven to begin with, right? We had this 10-line stanza with a quatrain and then a sextet, right? So we had 4 and then 6. So that was the pattern was not clearly established in the first stanza. The second stanza is that runaway sentence, which should be 4 lines, but instead is 6 lines, right? Because it's jammed all over itself, right? That one big 6 lines in one breath. Well, at least the first 5 lines in one breath stanza, right? But then we get into the main rhythm of the poem. 8 lines, quatrain, quatrain. 8 lines, quatrain, quatrain. 4 lines, quatrain. I think this is meant to be a break in that pattern. That is, we get our 5th a perfect quatrain. Perfect quatrain in the sense of like that one sentence per quatrain pattern, right? We can hear it. We can hear it, and our brains will expect now, because we've gotten it twice in a row already, right? We're going to be expecting that 8-line pattern will have sunk in by now. We're expecting another quatrain that will correspond to this. We got the halls and then the light in the halls. We got the verbs of what was happening in Khazad-dûm, and then we got the nouns of the stuff that was being created in Khazad-dûm. Then we got the quatrain on the music, awakening beneath the mountains, and then we get nothing. There is no further quatrain. Vardendil, I think that's exactly right. And unexpectedly, the silence descends. The music is announced triumphantly with the trumpets ringing, and then the music stops. It's not just, it doesn't just cease, it's interrupted. The pattern is interrupted. Stanza 5 is short on purpose, because Khazad-dûm itself, the glory of Khazad-dûm, which is what has been described in these central stanzas, right? With these 5 quatrains in a row, which should have been at least 6 quatrains in a row, they've been cut off. They've been cut off. And to Juice Man, I agree. I bet you Gimli would give a dramatic pause there. Because what comes next? The world is grey, the mountains old, the forge's fire is ashen cold. No harp is rung, no hammer falls, the darkness dwells in Durin's halls. The shadow lies upon his tomb in Moria, in Khazad-dûm. But still the sunken stars appear. So it's before and after. Before and after. Right? Hang on. Save your observations on the last stanzas. We're not going to talk about them tonight. We'll come back to them next time. I'm still focused. I'm reading stanza 6 because I'm still trying to understand stanza 5. Right? The music is interrupted. The glory ends in mid-stanza. And what we get next is simply the aftermath. This song of Khazad-dûm does not tell anything of the story of the fall of Khazad-dûm. It acknowledges the present state of Khazad-dûm. Right? Stanza 6 gives us that description. The ashen cold forge fire. No harp is rung, no hammer falls, the darkness dwells, the shadow lies upon his tomb. Durin is dead. Durin's folk are gone. The music is silent now. How did that happen? It happened in that missing quatrain, right? Maybe more. You never know. Could have gone on for an even longer time. We might have gotten more about what they did, what they accomplished, but it ends. It ends. I think that's why we get a 4-line stanza there. Not in the middle, but near the end of it. Yeah, JJ, what we don't... Yes, you're right. It's very unlike the Hobbit's Dwarf song, which is all about the coming of the dragon and their desire for vengeance. Yes, think about the description, beneath his feet, beneath the moon, right? The description of the coming of the dragon, right? And I agree. The intention of that poem is to place the emphasis on what Smaug did, right? That song is designed to keep alive the memory not only of that which was, but of that which took it away. so that Thorin and company can work to bring their curses home to Smaug. Right? This, I agree, JJ, is totally opposite to that. This is not a Balrog song. This song isn't even going to mention Durin's Bane. This is a song about Khazad-dum. And it comes to its triumphant conclusion with the ringing of the trumpets, and then breaks off clumsily. That is in the middle of what should be a stanza. And there's missing bits. Well, that's an interesting question, Sharon. Is there any sense that the missing quatrain was left out on purpose? That is to say that there are, like, it does exist. Gimli just skipped that bit. It's possible. You never know. On the one hand, you never know because dwarves, right? That is the secrecy of the dwarves and all that sort of thing. Like that might be something that they really don't want to talk about. So maybe it gets left out of the Westron version, right? It's conceivable. Like that's possible. But I don't think so. I don't think so just because of where the focus of this poem is. Notice how little narrative there is in this poem. Like, there's more than one sense in which an account or even a reference, an account of or a reference to the Balrog's destruction of the awakening of the Balrog or whatever would be out of place, right? It would not only be out of place because it's like a downer, and this is a poem about the glory of Khazad-dûm, but also because notice nothing happens. Like, Durin founded Khazad-dûm. Does that happen in this poem? No. That is to say, that's not what's described in the poem. The only action is he sees the crown of stars appear over his head, right? And then, a king he was on carven throne in many Hillard. So, like, historical account, right? Historical narrative plays no part in this poem. It's all, like, static descriptions. This is a poem telling us about Khazad-dûm and what Khazad-dûm was like, right? It doesn't tell us about what happened. Not even the foundation. All of that stuff is implied. All of that progress is implied. Yeah. So, yeah, it's not a poem about that. So any kind of historical reference or account of it would be out of place. It's just not it's not what this poem is interested in. And I think it wants to keep it. It wants to keep it absent. Because again, it's not giving an account. It's describing the before. It's describing what it was in its glory. And then it's describing now, after. The before and the after are the frame, the beginning and the end of the poem. The first 10 lines and the last 10 lines. The middle of the poem is all about the place, what it was, what it meant, not what happened there. Yeah, Gildalwyn, I think that's right. It's not a history. It's a picture of the experience. Yeah. Yes. Yes. All right. Well, we'll come back and we'll look at the end, and then I'll finally let you guys talk about the last couple stanzas. You were absolutely And I'm not, by the way, disagreeing with any of your observations, which are excellent. Sorry to frustrate you. We'll get there. We just have to be orderly about this stuff, where we'll lose our place and lose track of stuff. So we will come back. We'll talk about the last 2 stanzas, the last 10 lines, and then we'll. Then after we do that, we'll start looking at some other stuff. All right. Because I want to go back and I want to look at the shape of it some more, because there's more cool stuff going on. All right. Thanks, everybody. That is the end of our book discussion for tonight. We're gonna do our field trip. Thanks, those of you who are able to join us here. What are we doing? I remember what I'm doing. All right. Yeah, thank you. Okay. All right. Good evening, Valori.
Good evening. You'll forgive me a little giggle. We kept talking about trumpeters trumpeting and harpers harping. My brain starts going pipers piping.
Yeah,
Lords of
I was thinking the same thing. I will be honest with you. The harpers harped, the minstrels sang. Yes,
the lords leapt. Yeah,
the lords leapt. Yeah, yeah. The ladies danced. No, I was thinking the same thing.
Well, good to know I'm not the only one.
No, and I think it's actually a fair comparison. So let's think about that for a second.
Mm-hmm.
In the 12 Days of Christmas, right? Notice how that has the same pattern.
Yes.
It's reversed, but it's a lot like that 4th stanza, the noun and verb thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the 12 Days of Christmas, the first 5 days of Christmas are about things.
Mm-hmm.
The last 7 days of Christmas are all about verbs.
Mm-hmm.
Right? From the the swans are swimming and the maids are milking and the geese are laying and like it's all about what they do. I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
about things also, but it's all about the movement. It's all about the motion. It's all about the verbs.
Yeah.
Right. So it's definitely another example of sort of where like the poem is kind of doing the same thing. And the same kind of thing, dividing between nouns and verbs, emphasis on nouns
Mm-hmm.
and emphasis on verbs. Nouns are still there, but it really, you don't, like when you sing the 12 Days of Christmas, my family has a tradition of doing this. So we get together and now like all of my siblings and all of their kids and everybody all get together for a big Christmas exchange at Christmas. So we have this big room and we do a big Christmas carol sing together and everything. And so we do like the thing where you like sing the 12, like you break the room up into like 4 parts and then we kind of sing it in a round, right? The 12 Days of Christmas.
Yeah, and you see who misses it and make fun of them, and someone will inevitably sing 3 French men.
Right, exactly. Well, and you've got to like, and of course there's like the hamming up of the 5 golden rings, right?
Oh yeah. The bigger the better, the louder.
Exactly. So, and just singing it in that kind of an environment, right? You just you feel it, like the emphasis is all on the actions.
Exactly.
Little kids in the room will all start like they'll start leaping around and dancing around, right? Like they you can feel the importance of the actions there, that it's not just the things anymore.
Yeah, it's a monumental thing. That's the first song we put on when we put up the Christmas tree. Is John Denver and the Muppets singing that one. So that's the first one
Right.
on a Christmas together. That's the album. We always have to start tree trimming to.
Hey, Michelle, we're headed back to the Chamber of the Crossroads, so we should.
All right, Chamber of the Crossroads.
We got to ride. Still.
Yeah, Halloween ain't even over. Why are we talking about Christmas?
That's right. Well, it's your fault because we're talking about.
Yeah, probably.
Though, I mean, again, that there are some genuine similarities between those elements of Gimli's song and.
Oh yeah. all leads up to must be a king. Why? He's got rings of power over the door.
Right. Rings of power, obviously. Yeah. Okay. So we did the peak, which was very interesting. And we're gonna head out to, so we're gonna head out to the trees, right?
Yep.
That's right. And we can't even stable master to the Xeric Zigil dude because he's not okay. So we're gonna. Oh right, that's a campsite. No. Fine. Let's head out then.
Afraid I'm following your lead. I'm not sure where it is.
All right. Let's see if we can make it here. Okay.
This is the part where last time we went in a circle.
Well, you know.
I'm sure it's easy to do if you're not a dwarf.
Yeah, it wouldn't be more, if you didn't feel at least a little bit lost.
Like being lost in the world's biggest car park.
It's one of those things, you know? Like, it's where, like, when you're playing, it's kind of annoying, but at the same time, it's, like, true to the experience.
Oh, yeah.
You know? Just like the Old Forest, same thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's supposed to be confusing. Or Mythmoot, yeah. Also true to the experience. Okay. So now here, if I recall, we just head more or less in this direction. Okay. Oh yeah, here we go. All right. All right, let's just mount here because I want to get the effect of shifting from this section into the next section. So the first thing we notice from here is the difference in the lights. No, we got some of those out there too. Okay, so we got some lights which are the sort of dimmer, more greenish light, and some that are bluer, almost purpley, like the one above us here. And we've seen the ones that are sort of orangey too. So these crystals are, you know, different. This is Durin's Crossing, which we haven't been to, apparently, as I'm getting the thing now. What's going on here? Huh. Just 4 platforms at this?
Yeah, with mineral deposits.
Yeah, well, that could happen. You know, nothing to be embarrassed of, really. But, so north is just up straight towards Xeric Zigil. Yeah? Okay. What do you think why do you think they made these platforms at the crossroads? Like
maybe some kind of marketplace?
Oh, well, that's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. Because you wouldn't need guard posts or anything, really. I mean, this is just within the kingdom, right? But yeah, this would be, the crossroads here would presumably be a great place for...
Especially since we know, like, you know, up in Xeraxagil, we're going to see more things that were, you know, geared towards commerce, maybe, or food. Right.
Yeah, I like it. I like that idea of a market at the crossroads here. That would fit. You could have different... you know, kind of themed, like have, you know, food sellers on one platform and, you know.
Grinding wheel over there.
Right. Yeah. You could have all kinds. Yeah, no, I like that. That makes a lot of sense. Various stalls. Yeah. Right. Exactly.
Yeah, and it doesn't block the road.
Yeah.
There's parking space over here. If you have to go.
Right.
No, I'm being in earnest, actually, but.
Yeah. No, I like it. Okay, cool. So, something like the...
You figure a place like Moria would have several marketplaces.
Oh, sure.
Just dotted all throughout.
Oh, sure. Okay. So...
Getting all green and humid in here.
Okay, and here comes the greenery.
I like how the air gets that sort of misty quality you get when you step in a greenhouse.
Right now, I'm looking carefully at the ceiling because we've got the carven, vaulted doors, and then, boom, all of this
Oh.
vast expanse, but the ceiling is still patterned.
The ceiling almost looks like there's a hatch that could be opened.
Yes, it kind of does. And that light, yeah, I mean, there's no way that ceiling could actually be like the retractable dome of a football field or something. But I agree, it has almost that kind of a sense, right?
But yeah, I was thinking more like little tiles that you'd push back or something like that. Maybe depending on the time of year, because the sun's arc would change over the year.
Yeah. But the light, the one shaft of light coming through, I mean, presumably they didn't build it just so that it shone one beam down to one part of this enormous garden, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like that one's just like a malfunctioning panel up there.
Right. Yeah, it's cracked or something, and so now it was closed. It was left closed, but it has been cracked or something over time, and so this one shaft comes in. But I would imagine that the track that the light made. So if we imagine that square on the ceiling opened, right, the track that light would form on the floor would be where all these things were planted, right?
I think so. It sort of well, like I want to see the rest of the potting areas and see,
Yeah.
because like over here we got some dirt for a tree, looks like a choke cherry tree or something.
Right. Yep. No, there's definitely imported dirt, which has to go down a fair ways.
And probably a lot of compost as well.
You'd think.
Dwarfs got to eat. Dwarfs got to have. These guys are new. I don't think I've seen these guys before. Look at these plants over here.
Yeah, and you see things. Notice how with the wetness of the air, we get that we haven't had this kind of like mossy growth and stuff down in the cracks.
Yeah.
There hasn't been stuff growing out of the cracks in the floor before. But as hot and damp as it is in here, we see that in the tiles.
Yeah, you can see that the dirt deposits have sort of leaked out of their bed and just gone other places, and the greenery's gone with them.
Yeah. Yes. Interesting.
Also, how uneven the floor is.
Yes.
The tiles have been making a break for it in many places.
What's this dwarf? Is that two hammers he's got? The one hammer in his right hand.
One looks like more like an axe than a hammer, but let me see. I can't tell very well from here. Excuse me. We're getting a lot more of these glowy gems around here.
So do you think that the crystals emit enough light?
I don't know what kind of light are on what spectrum, so I couldn't really think of that. Like, do they photosynthesize crystal light or something?
Well, that's what I'm wondering. I mean, there's a lot of greenery in here.
See, that's a hammer for sure, and this one
The
is...
one on the left is a hammer. Can we get up there? Yeah, we can, huh?
It's actually a little harder to see over here.
Which side do you guys
Almost
get
too
up?
close to it. I think they're both hammers are slightly different design.
Oh, I see the ramp over there.
So we think his name is like Oleg Two Hammers or something?
Well, I was just wondering whom you build a statue for. Yeah, it does look like a hammer.
The first gardener?
Well, exactly. Is it does this statue in the center of the garden space celebrate like the designer of the garden space, or does it celebrate some other like warrior king, you know?
Or possibly the ingenuity behind it all. Like he figured out how to grow plants in a mountain, which is
Right.
sounds pretty impressive.
It's possible. I mean, those don't look like the most threatening warhammers he's got.
Yeah, they
Is it?
look more like for demolition.
Right. Right.
Ooh, fountain. Like a waterfall thing over there. The water features in here. This would make the best lazy river.
Yeah, so the waterfall comes in. I want to
Hmm.
slide down
Yeah,
here.
down here on the other side.
Um,
Look at the color of the water.
let's see. What do I have over here? Ah, can kind of peek through. So this is interesting. I'm trying to see if I can get up here without falling. Okay. Yeah. All right, so here we can see huge beds, this whole recessed terrain here.
Uh-huh.
Look at the water's like steaming.
But yeah, and that green color. It's like maybe it's like fortified with some kind of mineral or something.
Yeah.
Maybe that's part of what the secret of the plants is that fortified water or something. Like they found a natural mineral deposit that's good for
Yeah, maybe.
growing. I want to swim in it though. Like I said, this looks like it would be the best lazy river ever.
I have to admit that although I'm very ready to believe that they had designed this in such a way to allow plenty of sunlight in to keep the trees alive back in the day.
Yeah.
It does require from me a little bit of suspension of disbelief to believe that all of these green trees could have survived after it had been closed up and neglected for, you know, a solid millennium.
Well, yeah, which does lend credence to your crystal theory as well.
Well, I mean, it would almost, based on what they're showing us here, would almost have to be. I mean, the one thing that I would expect that doesn't, so like, look, if they are photosynthesizing from the crystals, you'd expect plants to be growing thickly right around where the crystals are, right? But they're not really.
Maybe these trees have evolved to require less sunlight and more feeding off of whatever's in the dirt.
Maybe.
But you're right. If they weren't getting enough sunlight, they'd be shutting down and losing their leaves and keeping their sugars underground.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's hard because what this suggests to me, like the issue that this raises is it becomes a really interesting adaptation question, right? Because when we come back to what they're trying to do in depicting Moria, I mean, like for instance, I was just thinking about this kind of a thing in a totally different context earlier today. I was thinking about translating poetry, and or not even poetry, just translating prose. And there's always the question of like, are you going to try to be accurate to what the text actually says, like what the words mean exactly and how the syntax works exactly and that sort of thing, or are you going to be be true to like the tone and feel of the thing? Because of course, if you laboriously translate it word by word, it's going to sound very different from how the original sounds. But if you try to make it flow like the original, you're going to have to leave the words behind.
Yeah,
some
I'm
ways.
reading The Hobbit to my 8-year-old right now, and if she loses interest on the long paragraphs, I'll sometimes sum up.
Yeah, no, exactly. Exactly. I mean, that's very natural. So, anyway, the point is whenever you're doing when you're doing a translation, you're always having to choose between those things. Like you can rarely perfectly capture both things.
Hmm.
And adaptation is also very much like translation. So when we think about um, what what they're capturing, you know, in this in Moria, as they're laying out Moria, as they're doing this, what do they want to accomplish? Well, they're I'm sure there are more than two things, but there are at least two things, right, that are really
Hmm.
important to try to capture in giving players the experience of going through Moria. One
Hmm.
is to try to convey to us the grandeur and
Hmm.
wonder of Khazad-dûm, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But the other is to try to capture um, uh, the the uh, the starkness, the desolation, the darkness, the um, the ruin of Moria. Um,
Well, and with that, some suggestion of the grandeur of old.
sure, exactly, and then exactly. So the point is, there's like a balance between the two, right? That you need
Hmm.
to maintain.
Yeah,
But like with translation, you can't always do both perfectly, and sometimes in
yeah,
some passages you might feel that you've really got to choose, like this passage of this story, like it's really important to get the flow and the feeling of it right, even if I have to leave the literal words translation further behind. But like feeling this moment is the most important. Like it's so important that it's worth it, right? Losing the words.
yeah, yeah.
And or the other way around, right? Or you might get to say like, well, no, the like the actual words that are chosen here, the actual like, like that's what really matters. And so even if I'm going to make it sound a little stilted or funnier than it is in the original, it just feel weirder than the original does, but it's worth it in this for this, like, to capture these words is worth it.
Hmm.
Um,
Well, and I love this place. I love Tarak Bazan, this part of Sirak Sigil, because it is unexpected. It's giving us a practical solution to an underground problem. It's also
yes,
giving us a side of dwarves that we don't see very often.
yeah, I
How many
agree.
of us? How many of us even knew there was a garden in Thorns Hall? Like I found it 4 years after playing.
Right, exactly. No,
But
I agree. This is a really important. Oh, look, it's more of the green water, um, which is clearly steamy. Um,
yeah,
but
looks really inviting.
but but yeah, I think that this is a place I could sit here and criticize and say, well, this is ridiculous. These trees wouldn't still be alive. Like, that's not right. Like I could do that. And I think that's probably true. Like, I don't really see in here sufficient justification wholly to convince me that these trees would still be alive, even if they
Yeah,
were photosynthesizing from the crystals.
yeah,
And
it's
yet,
definitely wibbly wobbly, magicy wagicy.
right, exactly. And yet, it works. I like it, right?
Yeah, and
Because,
it's a great tonal break as well from all
right,
of the rock and the geometric stuff. We finally have something organic and messy and beautiful.
yeah, this is one of those moments where they're trying to capture, they're choosing to kind of come in on the side of the wonder of Moria of old. When you come like, oh, they're gardens. Oh, look, they grew trees and grew food here. Like this is, and it's not just food. This is not like orderly crops in rows, right? This is trees and forest, right? This, I
Yep.
mean, maybe they were fruited trees, but still, I mean, like, look at this, like, row, this like avenue of trees here, right? You can't tell me
Hmm.
this is the most efficient farming ever. um but anyway, yeah, so just as you say, how unexpected it is, how beautiful and strange and different it is. I do think that if they were trying to be perfectly accurate about what it would look like, what they would have given us here is still the water still, and like the skeletons of the dead trees. So that we could see where their gardens once were. But that wouldn't have the same effect. That would have a very different effect on our imaginations when we came in. And what they've done here is, yes, it's true, on like second or third thought, you're like, yeah, this doesn't really work. These trees wouldn't really live. They wouldn't really survive. But the first reaction is, wow. Oh, I mean, and that accomplishes something. That's worth it to me. That's worth it to me. Just like, as I say, when you lean one way or the other in the translation choice, it can be worth it either to leave the words behind or to leave the tone behind in order to accomplish one or the other. And I think this is one of those moments in the adaptation where they do that.
I love all the holly trees too. Like, you wonder if there was some elf architect who helped out.
Yeah. Well, yes, you do wonder that. It would be really interesting. We don't see it, I don't think. It would be really amazing if there were like an elf statue in here too, like a dwarf statue of an elf.
Probably got knocked down a long time ago.
Yeah, maybe. Because I would not be in the least bit surprised if there were elves involved. This isn't on the direct route from the West Gate.
Also the present of the sacred holly too, though. That's definitely
You'd think, yeah. I'm going to the roots because again, it's because it's not like this has been built just for the benefit of the elves, like passing through or something like that.
Oh yeah, no, this.
But I mean, it could have been, like it might have been, like that. But that's not what we get here. This is more. I mean, it's this dogleg north, right? Still paralleling the main path, but it's separate from the main path, and that's really interesting. Anyway, all right, we should probably finish tonight, and next time we'll continue looking around a bit through here, but then head out. Remember to stop by the actually, hang on a second. Let me do that right now. Let's find the stable master, and then we'll go.
Oh, yeah.
Because if we can stable master to here next time, that'll save us some time. And reduce the chances of getting lost.
Just a side note, I'm seeing some of those reflective mirrors that we've seen in all the other chambers as well. Which implies that this place was well lit, and the note on the mirror was recently destroyed by a goblin. So, with all the growth here, it kind of hints that it was a functioning room until recently because the goblins decided to mess stuff up.
Right. Oh boy, nobody. The stable master at the Chamber of the Crossroads is useless. Doesn't go anywhere.
Yep.
That's ridiculous. Well, fine. It's our second stable master who does not connect to the Crossroads stable master.
These dwarves are a crotchety lot, aren't they?
Yeah. No, right. Well, fine. That's okay. Maybe it'll be useful someday. But probably not. Anyway, okay. Well, anyway, next time we'll come through here, and then we'll head out towards the Stone Hall. But there's this whole area in between that we'll want to check out before we get to the Stone Hall. Maybe we can dash ahead to the milestone down there at the Stone Hall for next time. But all right. Very good. Well, thanks everybody for joining us tonight, and we'll see you guys next week.
Great. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.